Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming to the stage Daryl Owens, Director of Government Relations with America's Warrior Partnership. Daryl will be moderating a panel discussion around A View from the Hill.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the warm introduction and the warm applause here. I appreciate it. And I know it's the last day. We're very excited. What a great event so far. Can we get a round of applause? Who's excited? What a great day. What a great event. So this is the last panel, and they saved the best for last. We got a bunch of rock stars here about to come on stage in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to tell you why this panel is so important. This panel, I mean, the work you guys do in this room, the work that your organizations do, the work that we do together for our veterans needs to be taken not just in a silo where we are in the communities, but to a broader level and policy in Washington, D.C. So that's where I came in. Again, my name is Daryl Owens. I'm a Director of Government Relations for America's Warrior Partnership. And some of the folks you're going to meet today also work in both the Hill. They've worked in all types of roles in the government. And they take what you do and they take the voice of the veterans to Capitol Hill. And they represent that veterans' voice on Capitol Hill, which is so important now more than ever. And not just on Capitol Hill, both at the White House, both in the VA, both at the agencies, the state level. So without further ado, let me get into some of the folks you're going to meet today who are going to be presenting some of this. And I wanted to do a little bit differently and want to introduce them individually because they are rock stars. They really are. All right, Christine. And then next up, we have a woman who is amazing. She is a colonel of the Air Force Reserve. She has led several programs and offices at the Small Business Administration, including the Office of Veteran Business Development, and she was the Deputy Associate Administrator of the Office of Disaster Assistance. She is now up at Syracuse University's Institute for Veterans and Military Families as the Director of Program and Services. Ladies and gentlemen, Barb Carson. Okay, so now that we have two terrific Air Force officers on stage, it's time to talk about the rest of the services here. So next up, we have a former naval corpsman who worked at OSD and was appointed to Commission on Care under George W. Bush, and is currently I want to make sure I get this right here, the Wounded Warrior Project. He's the Vice President of Government and Community Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, Jose Ramos. And last, and definitely the tallest, and as a good friend of mine, a Marine Corps veteran and a great friend. He worked in the Senate for a long time with me in the U.S. Senate, and was over the VA Office of Congressional Affairs, and is currently the Executive Director of Mission Roll Call, my good friend, Cole Lyle. Okay, now who's excited to get started here? Let's start off with some good questions. I'm just going to fire away if I can. Christine, are you ready?
Ready.
All right. So the first one's for you.
Okay.
So as we've all heard and we've all probably experienced at some point, access to care is an important issue for all veterans. And it's changed dramatically over the past 10 years, especially with the passage of the Choice Act and the Mission Act. Yet veterans today still face long wait times for access to care. And under current policy, there's a lot changing here. Secretary McDonough commented earlier this year about the growing cost of the successful community care program, that it was taking away money from traditional VA care. Can you kind of lay out kind of what the current lay of the land is and what you see coming in access to care?
Well, certainly. Fortunately, I've been with the community.
Turn your mic.
She said it was on.
Is it on? Okay.
Can you hear me now? I used to fly in airplanes. So I've been fortunate to be with the House Veterans Affairs Committee since 2014, and that's when the scandal in Phoenix broke and kind of recognized that even though VA had been authorized to provide community care all along, a lot of the medical centers were waiting until the end of their fiscal year before allowing veterans to go out and seek care in the community if it was needed. And I worked on the Choice Act, and then with Dr. Rowe, we recognized that there were some serious limitations with that program and came up with the Mission Act. And while there's a lot of emphasis on wait times, there are several other criteria that would enable a veteran to seek care in the community if that was appropriate. Things like drive times. If you're down in the Savannah area, the Charleston VA is your medical center. That's a 2-hour drive. That's a solid 2-hour drive. And doing that when you have a bad back or any other kind of serious issue, or if you just have a job, it's just not feasible. So we really try to emphasize that the community care is not replacing VA, it's supplementing VA. And we say that over and over again. And a little discouraging to hear some dialogue that talks about, well, community care is taking away resources from the VA. The 23 budget has, for medical services, medical care, it includes infrastructure as well, but it's about $123 billion for fiscal year 23. Community care is about $29 billion. That's not taking away resources from VA. And it was said earlier today, VA will always be funded. And yes, VA will always be funded. VA plays a very important role. It does certain things very well. But does every VA medical center have to have a world-class cardiologist? No. And you got to recognize that VA, in partnering with their community medical centers and other assets, and we have some great groups here that handle behavioral health and mental health and substance abuse care. Recognizing that there are resources that can do as well as VA and can meet needs of certain veterans is where we on the committee, or at least in my side of the committee, we are going to continue focusing on that and make sure that that stays an option for any veteran that needs it.
Thank you, Christine. I think the mic's working now. I think we're good to go. So the next question, so by the way, if you're at home or here in the room, if you have questions or want to ask a question, please write it down at the end. We'll have time for questions. If you're at home, if you want to submit it online, Caitlin's volunteered to ask all the questions for you. Sorry, Caitlin. So in the meantime, hopefully we'll turn over to you for the next question here. So the Wounded Warrior Project, you guys have been a great partner and ally. We love working with you in Washington, D.C. So recently, even on the Team Coalition that helped with the PACT Act, but recently, I understand you guys had a big fly, and you had about 50 Wounded Warriors coming into Washington, D.C. Talk about some issues on Capitol Hill. Can you talk about some of the issues you're working on that they brought to Congress and they were talking about when they were there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first and foremost, thank you for having us here. I appreciate the work that you did and the help getting the PACT Act passed. So recently, September 12th, or the week of September 12th, we had close to 50 warriors coming in from 25 different states, meeting with about 55 different offices, about 31 different actual members engaged with those warriors. And really, they came in for two purposes. One is to be better educated on how to be advocates for themselves. And two is to encourage members of Congress to focus on a few key issues that are important to us. Primarily focused around women veterans, around mental health, suicide prevention, and veteran benefits. We also had a group of 25 women participate in our first DC Women Warrior Summit, and they had the opportunity to meet with both Republican and Democratic members of the Women Veteran Task Force to talk about the challenges and issues that women veterans uniquely face as it relates to transition and gender-specific services for them within the VA. From the mental health standpoint, I think specific to women veterans, one of the focus was on a bill specific to peer support for those survivors of MST to ensure that they have enough resources and services provided to them so that when they do, for example, file a claim, that there's somebody on the back end connecting with them to ensure that there's clinical care or a touch point, not just the benefits aspect for it, right? Mental health care, it's similar. It's focused on specific to, for example, the STRONG Act and other peer support type of legislation that supports and encourages or increases resources for VA, for peer support, for community-based support, as well as research as it relates to substance use disorder and comorbid or co-occurring issues as it relates to PTSD and MST. And I specifically led a group focused on veteran benefits, specific to one issue that's near and dear to my heart. It's the Brian Newman, Mark O'Brien Clothing Allowance Act. What this bill does is current policy right now for VA is if you're an amputee, wheelchair bound, or someone who relies on a clothing allowance so that you're replacing your attire, prosthetics wear down, the arm or my arm wears down my suit pretty fast, right? So VA provides us with a clothing allowance, and we have to apply every year. And part of that process is, quite frankly, at points, veterans choose not to, and this bill specifically requires that those who have static or injuries, as I like to say, my arm's not going to grow back, right, shouldn't have to reapply every year, and so that legislation does that. And the other one is the Richard Starr Act. Richard Starr Act, as you're well aware, is a bill that recognizes that the VA benefit compensation for your disability is separate to your VA retirement, and for those who are medically retired, specifically a result of combat injuries, should be eligible to both benefits. Now, at the end of the day, I think anyone should be eligible for both their VA retirement and their VA compensation and VA retirement, because they're two distinct. But the Richard Starr Act specifically helps about 50,000 combat medically retired veterans. And combat is defined not necessarily just as front action combat, but those injured while training for combat.
That's a lot of important issues, and as you can tell, a lot of it is they're common sense fixes to changes and things that are already out there. I mean, policy in D.C., as I'm sure you would agree, is all about incremental changes and steering the bigger ship just a little bit left and right sometimes because it doesn't move on a dime. But that's great work you're doing, Jose, and thank you for that. So, Barb, I'll turn it over to you next. So, IVMF, you guys have also been a great partner for a long time, especially in research. So, with so many policy changes happening on Capitol Hill and the veterans space at large, what information and data do you think are helping inform policymakers as they go forward, both in the VA and in Congress?
I'll share some that are really relevant, and you've heard echoes of these through other panels that have happened this week already, so I'll try and bring something new and look forward to questions if I miss anything at all. And I also want to thank, as Jose did, America's Warrior Partnership for the collegial approach to the work that we do. We do similar things. We have different specialties, and I really appreciate all that I've learned and will be able to take back. So thank you to all of you who've contributed this week. One of the things that I love about data is that we're working close with partners. We aren't doing it alone. And one example of that recently was a study that is not yet published, but we can share the summary of that with a PDF that we'll be happy to load on how do they certain elements of the VHA regionally or in smaller offices engage with the community-based organizations that are doing the work to connect us. So it looked at 7 America Serves communities and the data from those organizations along with the VHA to see where is the path going, how are they connecting, how are they being served. And we've identified several things that make it work better and things that are detracting, that none of those are surprises, that we will get into those later in this panel, but include interoperability of systems, just the ability to refer to each other, going across networks. We sometimes have false barriers, like a state line. What else, where are those other barriers? We're going to elevate those so that we can work together, both at a national, state, and then I'd include county and city level to really resolve these.
That's terrific. Well, Barb, thank you. And thank you for sharing the information. We'll have to get that out to everyone here shortly once you publish. We'll put it up on the website or something as well. Great work on that, by the way.
Thanks. And I did forget, I'm remiss if I didn't acknowledge Leslie Hausman, Dr. Leslie Hausman, who was with the VA, and she is in Pittsburgh. She had to leave early, but she was instrumental in bringing this forward with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. If you're on an airplane right now listening at the airport, thank you if you're out there. So next up, we'll turn it over to Cole here. Cole, I got a great question for you. I know it's something you and I talk about all the time. You know, right now, the number of veterans in Congress, so those who have served in the military at all, is kind of at an all-time low. So trying to take that perspective of how veterans talk, the way they lead, the way they work, the way the military runs. It's hard to have that perspective sometimes on Capitol Hill, especially for those who've never served. But I understand Mission Roll Call recently did a big survey, and they're talking about the civilian attitudes toward the military and toward veterans. Do you want to talk briefly about that and what some of your findings are and what they kind of represent?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Daryl, for the question. Mission Roll Call is a national program that advocates in Washington, D.C. on behalf of about 600,000 veterans that we have opted into text and email polls. It's a more direct way that they can make their voice heard to policymakers on Capitol Hill, the Christines of the world. We give them questions about policy currently under consideration by either Congress, the VA, the White House, and get pretty instantaneous feedback and give that to those policymakers so they make more informed decisions about how veterans feel on certain policy. But recently we did a national research poll that was representative of the American population. You can go to missionrollcall.org under recent research and read the full report. But we wanted to get an idea because, as Darrell mentioned, having that perspective represented in Congress is a function of how the American people view and see veterans across the country. So we wanted to get a baseline of kind of what they thought about different veteran issues. There were some pretty shocking results, actually. Obviously, there's huge support for veterans generally. A lot of people that responded in the poll, when we broke it down by generation, we wanted to know who knew a veteran, who knew somebody currently serving on active duty. And for instance, not to pick on Gen Z, but Gen Z, there was like 67% that did not know a veteran or somebody on active duty. And when you correlated that with say, for instance, their willingness to recommend military service, they also had the lowest percentage of people that say that they would recommend military service to a family or friend, which is kind of indicative of what we know about veterans across the country. Military service is becoming a family business at any given time. You guys know the statistics. Less than 1% of the population serves on active duty at any given year. 80% of veterans have an immediate family member that served, meaning that military service is becoming a family business. So it's important to have that representation in Congress. And I would also note we are at a relatively low point of policymakers in elected positions, but as Christine could also tell you, I think less than 1% of Capitol Hill staff have military experience. And that is pretty concentrated amongst the committees of jurisdiction, the Veterans Affairs Committee, the Armed Services Committee. So there's not a lot of staffers that have that perspective. So that's part of the work we do, is just to go around the country. Not only do we do these polls and give them to members of Congress and staff, but we try to humanize these issues because staffers sometimes focus on abstract concepts. We do some content and tell individual veterans stories across the country because every veteran has a unique story.
May I add one thing to that?
Please.
At Syracuse, we do have a program that is working with veterans who are interested in public service and want to go run for office, and teaching them some really important basics, regardless of where they may fall on the spectrum parties. So we would love to follow up with that too and make sure that we can continue to support.
So kind of along those lines, I'm going to turn it over to Christine for the next question. It's kind of a follow-up. You know, given that not many staff and not many members have that perspective, both not just the veterans' perspective, but the former military experience perspective, it makes it hard to do oversight. It makes it hard to really engage if you've never waited at the VA for a medical appointment before, never really gone in. So as the access standard debate goes forward, I know the Secretary made recent comments about trying to include telemedicine as part of the access standard debate and changing the wait times based on your access. So what do you think is coming next from Congress as a response as this debate goes forward over when the referrals to community care should go forward?
We are continuing to work that. We have a lot of concerns. We have a bill that's currently out there called the GAPS Act that was looking at mission and essentially what gaps were still in the law there and how we could try and close them up some. And access standards were part of that. It's still under a good bit of debate. But telehealth is an incredible tool. It really is. And VA has led the way in telehealth. And it was seen during the pandemic where HHS was really picking up a lot of the kind of protocols that VA already had in place. Telehealth is incredible when you live in a very remote area, assuming you have broadband to handle that. But then also, so much of medical care and also, and especially mental health or behavioral health type care, you have to have a relationship. And just getting on the screen for a quick appointment, especially in a mental health setting, there's got to be some rapport and there's got to be some connection, some type of relationship established before you can say, okay, we've got this now. Now can I check in with you at any time and I'll use the screen? You know what I look like. I know what you look like. I know facial expressions now. So to kind of default to telehealth as, well, we can give you this appointment at this time and therefore we filled the square it was not the congressional intent, that's for sure. And we're going to continue to monitor that. And, part of our role is oversight. And we really do rely on inputs from all of you, groups. I've talked to so many people today who have given me different scenarios, different stories, a lot of ideas. I've got a lot of things I can, tee up at the beginning of the next Congress. So we really do rely on you and the stories you get from the veterans you work with, and also just the experiences you have in working with the VA and even trying to get policy changes.
Well, this is actually a great example of how we can poll veterans and give feedback to committees of jurisdiction. When the Secretary made those comments at the hearing, we put out a poll and said, should Congress codify the current access standards or allow them to change them, right? 78% said that the standards in place should remain the standards. So we fed that back to the committees and VA officials. And I think it was, I'm not going to take direct credit for it, but I think it was like 2 weeks later that the Secretary made the comments about, he kind of rolled it back a little bit and said he was going to use telehealth. But I agree with Christine. The relationship is super important. And sometimes, telehealth can be a good tool, but it shouldn't be a substitute.
Absolutely, great point, Cole. And then let me turn back to Barb here for a second. So Barb, as challenges remain in the VA, where do you think the future is for coordinated care networks, and where do you think Congress is right now on that issue?
The future of coordinated care. Just only need a minute for this, right?
That's all. Yep. Simple question, guys. And by the way, hope you're all throwing a bunch of questions on both the app and jot them down for later here. We got a great panel. So. Barb, I'll go back.
I'll start with just 2 bullets, and I'm sure we can come back to things as
sounds good.
If the group engages. But I'd start with data standards and interoperability, which I already alluded to earlier. So those of us who are in community-based organizations and networks, let's work out those data definitions amongst ourselves. That would be, that's really necessary in order for us to make meaningful referrals that we can track and ensure that the service is happening and that we have a way to broaden what we are offering to veterans. So I'd love to see that. And then with VA, I have been a federal employee for almost a decade, so I know some of the constraints. So I am very interested in, of course, making it more accessible to the public to know when we are thinking about changing something, making it better. Unless you troll the Federal Register or are a member of an amazing organization that looks out for you, you might miss it. And so I'd encourage the VA to continue to look at ways that they are collecting information and that those of us pay attention to those opportunities to weigh in on that as well. So that's one on data and interoperability. And the other would be about social determinants of health as an industry, that it can be profitable for some, and some are in the market, and it may not be incentivizing to collaborate. So looking at those places where we need to engage and find better ways to work together, to have a voice in how that is developing. And we can go into that more, or I can just pause there, but this should be a consideration when we're looking at technology, things like private-public partnership and how we write our agreements with each other, how challenging it is to write those agreements. Those are areas for more action, not just exploration. I think we've done a lot of that too.
Barb, I got to tell you, that was very impressive. That was a very hard question. You knocked it out of the park in 2 minutes. That's but most people in D.C., when you ask somebody, they'll filibuster that question because there's not really a good response. But Barb nailed that one on the head. That was very impressive. So bravo. And then, so let me just tee up one more softball here for Jose. This is just a small question, but over the last 20 years, the budget for the VA, it's gone up over 500%. This year, it's $301 billion. And the recent numbers state that the VA has grown to 440,000 employees. So what's your sense of Congress on the size of the VA? And it's growing at a sense, is there a growing sense that there needs to be some kind of structural reform or more accountability or more oversight? What do you think? Let me ask you that, Jose. Just again, softball question.
Yeah, it's not a softball question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I maybe put a little context around the growth, right? Last 20 years grown, I think it's 553% to be exact. 2001, we were not in a war, all right? We just spent 20 years fighting, which increased the utilization of VA tremendously. We went from about 6 million veterans utilizing the VA in 2001 to about 9.2 million using it today. The growth has in part been also not just in healthcare, a lot of it is in benefits, right? About 661% of the growth between 2001 and 2022 is mandatory spending, meaning VA benefits, right? At the same time, you look at kind of what we've done as a community and what we've pushed for as a community over the last 20 years. I look at this year alone, the passage of the PACT Act, which was projected to increase VA spending over the next 10 years by $321 billion, right? So I think context is a little bit where we have to kind of look back and say, why has it grown that much? In part, it's because we as a community continue to identify gaps and issues and challenges amongst those that we serve. And we ask Congress every year to pass a host of bills that traditionally comes with a price tag of some sort, right? I also want to put into context that healthcare as a whole has grown tremendously. In 2001, the national expenditure of healthcare was around $1.4 trillion. 2020, it was around $4.6 trillion. 2020 alone grew by like 9.7% that year, right? So healthcare in general is extremely expensive. So the discretionary spending has grown about 480 billion, 480% from 2001 to 2022 for the VA, right? So all that tells me a few things, but it tells me that we're asking more of the VA as a community. More warriors and more veterans are utilizing the VA as a byproduct of a 20-year war and a byproduct of aging veterans, right? And so when I look at Congress, really my job as an organization, as an advocate, and our jobs as advocates is identifying those continued challenges that require the Congress to intervene and or interact to ensure that veterans get the benefits that they have earned through their service and are provided the health care that they deserve, right? You know, I think that Congress, and Christine probably has a better response than I do, not to put her under the hot seat, but I think that they're going to continue to evaluate, and they do so, every policy and understand how it impacts the holistic, right? I think that, frankly, we're in a time in our country where, you know, we're all feeling a little bit of the squeeze financially, and so that also generates a broader discussion on where we spend dollars, not just VA specifically, but DOD, HHS, across the board, right? So those are the conversations that, frankly, are left upon Congress to have, not for the VSOs. As a VSO, our job is really to advocate for those services and needs, and I can tell you that the need is growing. We register 44 warriors a day at Wounded Warrior Project, so that need is growing and not going away.
That's, I mean, first of all, great points and very impressive context. I think you're exactly right. And 44 a day and being enrolled, I think many in the room will agree that some of the VA's best advocates are actually here in the room, getting people to get enrolled and get the benefits they've not only qualified for but earned. I think that's a very important point and very well stated. But so I'll kind of turn it back to the panel at large, see who wants to take this next question kind of as a follow-up. So given that, but still given that growth and over the past 20 years. We've seen this growth steady the entire time, but the suicide rate for veterans hasn't changed, and arguably, based on Operation Deep Dive's recent figures, has gone up, especially in recent times. And there's a new wave of overdoses and self-injury mortality that's kind of taking place right now that we're seeing. So how do we change? How do we get ahead of this? That's the next step. And again, another softball question for the panel here. So what needs to come next?
When I was here in 2019, the On the Hill panel was discussing the community grant program, and there was some significant argument. There was a lot of pushback from some sectors on the Hill, and it took time. You know, like you said, we can only make incremental changes sometimes. That aircraft carrier doesn't move too fast sometimes, but that was one program that we were able to get passed. Dr. Rowe yesterday talks about having to bring people in a room and make compromises. We had to make some compromises on that program. But, you know, just a few weeks ago, the first round of Staff Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox community grants were announced, and many people in this room received it. And, well, first of all, I want to say the day after, Jim, I'm gonna pull a Jim here. Staff Sergeant Fox's parents tweeted or put an announcement out that, these 80 community organizations that are going to receive this grant are honoring their son. And we are confident that you will. And that's one of the things that going forward, I want to hear from you. I want to know how to make this program better, how to make it easier to apply, make sure it's going to the right organizations, making sure that the outcomes are measured, that you're getting the support you need from the Hill, the support you need from VA. Don't want this to be a one and done pilot program. So I kind of forgot what the question was now, but I think this group and that community touch will make a difference in the suicide numbers. It can't just be go to the clinic or get your telehealth appointment. Suicide is just so much deeper than that, and it has so many other factors that are involved. So,
I just echoing those comments. I think the VA is slowly starting to get closer and closer to communities, and this is a step further in that direction. When you put it in context, though, only 50% of veterans in the United States are enrolled in VA healthcare, and even less use it on a regular basis. Their budget for mental health and traditional healthcare has, as been previously noted, skyrocketed over the last 10, 20 years. Outcomes have arguably not changed and maybe gotten worse. What are they doing to outreach to the other 50% of veterans? Some don't use VA because they have private health insurance. Some don't use VA because they, for reasons like that. But a large majority of them probably, have heard horror stories or tried to access VA and have gotten frustrated with the hoops they've had to jump through administratively. And I think the Fox grants are great because it puts the onus on community organizations that have touch points that will reach those veterans that the VA will otherwise not, because they either have preconceived notions about VA and healthcare, or they're just in communities that make it hard for the VA to reach them. So I think those that's a great step. But from a funding perspective and a sense of urgency perspective, it needs to grow. The VA's budget was $301 billion this year. I think the suicide prevention budget, which includes the Parker Gordon Fox grants, the Veteran Crisis Line, general advertising, so when you see things that say choose VA at like a hockey game or something, that was $475 million, which is 1/10 of 1% of that entire $301 billion budget. So I think fundamentally we need to change the way we look at this issue, because the VA primarily looks at suicide through the lens of mental health. And while having a diagnosed condition can give you a higher predisposition to go down that path, at the moment of decision, it could be a conglomeration of acute financial stress or relationship stress or any number of different things that have nothing to do with the service-connected mental health issue. So we have to fundamentally look at tackling this issue in different ways and get creative, because the status quo just is not working.
I'd love to build on that just a bit about some of the other streams that feed into this, and that could be, I am a fan of the Transition Assistance Program in that people are continually working to improve it. And if we're seeing that highest risk is among those who are left the service, that 1 to 3 years approximately, it's important that we get that right and continue to work hard. So I would like to just take the aperture, open it up a little bit, Department of Labor and the Small Business Administration, and working on the economic opportunity and employment opportunities for soon-to-be veterans as well as the military spouse. That security can be something that lessens the risk of feeling hopeless and suicidal. And I did want to mention some research that we are doing with Penn State. The first phase has just come out, and that is, you'll see it also reflected in proposed legislation, the Onward Opportunity Act. And that's where you do have an intervention that prepares you for a career. So those that the study has shown have gone through that are not only getting gainful employment, but they're making $6,000 more than somebody who hasn't gone through it. And that's an even greater amount per year for an E6 and below, which is counter to what most of us would intuitively think would be the case. And then for the Small Business Administration, they're creating, if you want to be your own boss, you've had enough of the taking orders. There are some incredible developments there. That's my sweet spot and one of my favorite spots for another time. But I really think that suicide prevention can and should include the work that's happening there. And a kudos to Ivan Denton at DOL Vets, who is beginning to include and has been the community-based organizations to make sure that they're a part of that path and all of this gets better connected.
That's great. I think Ivan's here someplace. If he's here, thanks Ivan, for all your working as a good Army officer as well. So then, Jose, let me follow up with you here. It's kind of on a tangent a little bit, but Dr. John Bursley this morning was talking about the PACT Act and how it was passed by Congress. It's been a groundbreaking piece of legislation that was pushed forward by both parties, very, very bipartisan. But a lot of that was kind of shepherded by Wounded Warrior Project and Alice Maraska on your team. You guys have a great team, and we love working with you guys. But the team coalition that he led really kind of helped lead the charge on some of the PACT Act stuff. So can you maybe talk about the implementation now going forward? Maybe Christine, you could talk to this as well, both the impact on both VBA and VHA going forward. I know there was initially some concern over the immediate rollout of some of these as well and how it's going to impact cases going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First of all, Alex did a tremendous job, and frankly, it wasn't just Alex, right? We had great organizations helping us out, VFW, American Legion, you guys, obviously, you know, DAV. I mean, it really was an effort, a community effort, right? You know, and John Borsler, it's funny you mentioned him in the previous question. John leads the Veteran Experience Office, and one of the things that they're charged with, frankly, is coordinating an effort, a presidential effort to organize about 9 different agencies to look at the MIL-SIV transition. I think in part to look at a veteran holistically, right? 14 of those committing suicide, regardless of the number. To be frank, as far as I'm concerned, one veteran is too many. Right?
Absolutely.
So regardless of the number or how you calculate it, one is too many, and 14 out of those committing suicide aren't using the VA system at all, right? In part because some just choose not to, some you know, don't have the resources or the help to get there. As it relates to the PACT Act, you know, first and foremost, I think we could not have done it without the leadership of the chair and ranking of both committees, Representative Bost and Takano on the House side, who Christine works with. Did an amazing job shepherding through the House. As they like to say, the House passed it first, right? And then got to the Senate and back to the House. And what we saw initially after passage, right, and now it becomes implementation and what does it mean? I think, quite frankly, VA did a pretty good job of starting to message right out of the bat. Now, I don't know that the messaging got to everybody or if it was a, you know, cohesive message right up front. I think, you know, they got out and part of it was initially indicating that the presumptive conditions were being enacted or started as of the day of enactment, which I think confused some folks. But nonetheless, VA has seen close to 200,000 claims. At least they report to VSOs periodically, and they tell us about close to 200,000 claims since enactment, right? But again, so from a claims process, I think last year VA processed 1.7 million claims. That's about a 12% growth over the previous year. That's a lot, and we expect a lot more from PACT Act. So VA has worked hard to try to hire an additional 2,000 plus claims officers, whether they're there or not. I think maybe Christine can provide more light on that. I don't specifically know if they've met that goal yet, but that's what they're trying to do. They're also looking at modernization or automation of claims. From a healthcare standpoint, October 1st was the launch date for anyone who deployed downrange through GWOT specifically to be eligible for healthcare through the VA. And they have a 1-year window to enroll, and then after that, if they don't make that 1-year window, they'll be going in through a phased-in approach. And I think the staffing, you talk about the percentage or the personnel, 440,000 employees. I think VA right now is missing or has about 40,000 vacancies. So they're going to have to rely on some community partnership to ensure that they get the care that they deserve.
Great point. Christine, do you want to add anything too?
On the healthcare side, it was really important to get healthcare first, not wait for a disability rating or the paperwork to go through. And like Jose mentioned, as of October 1st, anyone who served in combat post 9/11, that 5-year healthcare opportunities expanded to 10, and there is a 1-year open season. So please make sure everyone in your organization who may be eligible for that takes advantage of it. It was surprising how we did extend some dates a few years ago, and the uptick on it was very small. So we need to make sure that that word gets out. And then also over the next 10 years, we'll be phasing in eligibility for certain theaters, certain times of service, et cetera. But again, like I said, getting the health care first was, well, I'm a little biased on the health side, but it was important. And because we had a hearing on the PACT Act early, and we had one of our witnesses, his wife had died of what was probably most certainly some type of toxic exposure. And, he's like, getting a check in the mail is great, but if you can't get the health care, it's not of any use. So you make sure that your folks are aware. And like Dr. Rose said, compromise is how we get things through.
Absolutely.
And it seems like it takes forever, and people get frustrated. But when we first passed it out of the House, we really didn't include anything that accommodated this expansion of utilization, more veterans coming in the system. So by the time we got this PACT Act passed, it had billions of dollars. It had included 31 new medical facilities. It included a lot of incentive and recruiting opportunities for VA employees. It really tried to make sure that the framework was there when the veterans came.
Just to plug something Jim always says is together we can do better. And I think that's a great illustration of exactly how together you can work together to figure out how to make that happen. Because it takes both sides, everyone working on the same team, pulling the boat in the same direction to really make that change. And I'd be remiss, I want to give a quick shout out. I know Lindsay Deering's watching back home right now. She's going to be on this panel originally. She did with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, worked very closely in the PACT Act. So Lindsay, thanks for all your help with that too. Wish you could be here. And with that, I wanted to turn over for some questions. This is, if you want to turn the lights up, if that's okay back there, guys. So we can have some questions both from the audience, Caitlin, if you're ready, and then from anywhere else. We'll just toss them out here and see who wants to jump on it first.
So real quick from the app, we had one question that said, communities can't effectively coordinate care without agreed upon standards or shared measures. How does the panel see the difference in the roles of federal government, states, and non-for-profits, each in setting those standards of care?
Great question. So first of all, thanks for the question from remotely, and then I'm turning over to the panel who wants to jump on it first. Either maybe Christine, Cole.
Caitlin, what was the last part of that question about? Was it who?
How do you see the difference in the roles of federal government, states, and non-for-profits?
Yeah, I'm an end user of VA. I use VA for my primary health care, mental health care. The VA likes to say that it needs to be the coordinator of care. Oftentimes I've found, and I've heard from other veterans, that they feel when they go to primary care, their primary health care provider is not talking to their specialty health care provider. If they go to a vet center, that person's not communicating, so they have to reiterate a lot of stuff. I think, I wish that it was a billable thing for care coordination amongst communities, because I think, again, those folks are in unique positions to touch veterans that the VA will never reach, have a broader awareness of local resources that may not be veteran-serving organizations. They may be just civilian-serving organizations that could fill the need that the veteran is having. So from my perspective, I think that obviously you want coordination between federal resources, state resources, and local resources, but I think from a care coordination standpoint, somebody that's in your community it is probably best served.
And I think the question was specific to standards of care. That's exactly right, standards of care, right? So I think that's quite frankly, a very difficult question to answer, in part because each state has different standards for certifications of care, right? So we saw this with telehealth. A lot of emergency authorities to provide care, particularly VA, for example, to provide care across state lines. And we saw emergency authorities for other entities to do so that are going away, right? So I think not necessarily the coordination of care, but the standard of who sets that standard is really a state versus federal fight. And I don't know that frankly, I don't know how you answer that very honestly. What I do think is that there are initiatives like the Psych Pact, which is an initiative that's state-driven, governor-driven, that allows providers to get into a pact with other states so that they can utilize mental health providers, in this particular case, across state lines, regardless of their standards or certifications. So I think it's just a hard question to answer, to be very honest.
Very good question, though. I know the Federation of State Medical Boards has been very active in that space, especially for telemedicine for a long time, working with the VA, trying to figure out how to make those standards more uniform for a while, but I don't think they've quite figured out entirely how to get all the way. Is that Blake in the back there with the question?
Yeah, hey, Daryl, thanks. So that was actually my question. And you both hit on, I think, key points. But when we talk about standards of care, actually beyond just healthcare, when we say we hired a veteran, we got a veteran hired, we got a veteran matched, we got a veteran housed, what does that mean? Like, how do we set a standard of care inside of employment, inside of education, housing, healthcare, benefits, social enrichment? What are those standards of care? There's a lot of great work. We heard from Mary Beth Brueggemann in the social enrichment scale that they have. Team Red, White, and Blue has one. All of our employment partners do, but those are like nonprofit standards that we don't see at the state or federal level saying, yes, that's what the standard is in that specific functional area. So is it bottom up, top down? That was more the specific question, and I ran out of space. Thanks.
Yeah, I think when you phrase it like that, if there's no federal standard for that, I think it has to start there. If you want to get away from kind of the patchwork system of VSOs, and a lot of veterans, it's paralysis by analysis when they go out and they look at all these resources that are available to them, and they don't have one single person. That's where I was coming from with the care coordination to kind of shepherd them through. So the lady earlier was talking about she really appreciated the idea about the sponsor, like taking somebody through the whole process from DOD to VA. But if you're talking about standards of care for whole health, I think the VA likes to use the term whole health, but you will have to fundamentally change the way you look at suicide prevention in order to go that direction.
If I can throw something out there, just as from our perspective at America's Warrior Partnership, the community integration model fundamentally is making and building those relationships at the local level. Exactly right. So for us, not talking about a federal standard, but maybe the access standard you're talking, or the standard you're talking about, is telling your neighbor or your friend or the person you're working with in the community, I like my job. I've gotten great care when I had a problem over this for substance abuse, and it doesn't need to be registered necessarily at the state and federal level, but the person you're working with, whether it's in the Panhandle or in Alaska or Dinasba, is telling them, hey, I've gotten help, and I feel better about where I am right now because of this, because of the work we've done together, and here's why. And here's why my job is better now. Here's where I'm now at a better pace in my life. Or conversely, hey, thanks for your help with the job, but this isn't really what I wanted. This isn't my meaningful employment. This is what I want for my career. So help me out here, guys. Do you know anybody else who's retiring? For whatever profession you're in. So
this all starts with better data, though, right? I mean, you have to have better data that there has to be more coordination between local organizations and partnerships and the VA itself. And if a veteran using VBA services is tried this program or that program, or is enrolled in using post 9/11 GI Bill, things like that. So data sharing is super important, and that needs to be improved.
Blake, I can't read your mind, so I may be going a little broader than you are, but you mentioned a few standards of care, and I think you're trying to expand it beyond what VA might have. And also perhaps beyond just an outcome, that we are also trying to measure meaningfully the interventions that happen along the way. Not all of us are the one who does the last mile service, and yet all of the things that we're trying to do with each other have to have a standard as well. And that is a complexity that I'm not sure you were getting after in that question, but I look forward to following up.
Blake, great question. I think we have time for one more question. So Caitlin in the back here. Okay.
Hey, guys.
Hello.
I don't have my jacket on today, but I'm still going to ask a question. So one of the issues we run into in Indiana is definitions. And Barb kind of brought up some of the definitions that cause issues with collecting data. What is a veteran? How long did a veteran serve? Is it a veteran or not, or a National Guardsman? What are some of the definitions that you're seeing at your level that are going to affect veterans and veteran care in the future, that not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level?
I'm going to take a quick one because I forgot to say one thing that my colleague Zach Gibson let me know, that there is a great organization, Gravity Project, who has started to do data definitions for all social services. And that might be just a place to start. It's going to be my homework the coming week. Thanks.
One of the things we've been working on the committee is looking at an eligibility commission. The eligibility standards for VA care haven't changed in over 20 years. And then some. And exactly what is a veteran? How long do you have to serve? What should your status of discharge be? What Guard, Reserve? Where do they fit in? Who's eligible for a vet center? Questions like that, and we really just see too many people falling through the cracks because they either don't self-identify as a veteran or they are insisting on getting a full, package of benefits that may not be the right fit. So that's one thing we want to look at going forward is exactly that. What is a veteran and who does the VA serve?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would add that to Christine's point. I think, frankly, there isn't a consensus. I think eligibility for benefits is defined by statute, but collectively as a community, we have different ways of how we identify what a veteran is, how we identify what a caregiver is, how we identify what. So I don't know that there's a federal solution or a policy solution. I think, frankly, it's going to be something that we're always going to struggle with as a community, in part because, I look at, just to Christine's point, you look at vet centers that were designed for combat veterans, and then we changed that definition of what a vet center should be, or tried to include student veterans and then caregivers, and then so it really is how do we as a community see, but then also what do we as a community believe a veteran is entitled to as it relates to statute. I think those are two distinctions, and therefore would always drive different definitions of who is eligible or who is a veteran.
Thank you, Jose. And I think we're out of time, but I want to say thank you for all the questions. And I hope you all had a great lunch, and I hope it was delicious and tasty. And I hope during that time you kind of had a chance to appreciate how difficult policy is sometimes. It's complicated. It's not supposed to be easy. When we're serving veterans out from the VA or from Congress, you want to get it right. And sometimes you get it really close, and then it takes people who understand the policy up close to be able to tweak it around the edges a little bit more, just try to make it even more perfect every day. And maybe it will never be perfect, but we can always try, and we always will. And so with that, we didn't even get into some of the big topics like Air Commission and the future of the VA or others. So there's no shortage of topics in Washington, D.C. that we're working for you to push forward. So if you have any questions after us, please feel free to find one of us. And thank you for all for listening. And with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.